January 19, 1981, Singer Island, Florida. Joseph "Joe Dogs" Iannuzzi walked into the Don Ritz pizzeria, believing he was meeting men he had known for years. Men he had made money with, men he had gambled with, men he had eaten beside, and, most importantly, men he believed he could still reason with. At the center of them was Tommy A. Agro, a Gambino soldier, Iannuzzi's mentor, the man who had helped bring Joe Dogs deeper into the mafia world of South Florida. Their relationship had made both men money. Now money had become the reason Iannuzzi was sitting across from a man who wanted answers. Joe was behind on payments connected to their loan sharking business. Agro was furious, but Iannuzzi still believed this could be settled. Then the conversation changed. The men around him moved, and suddenly Joe Dogs understood that he had not been invited there simply to discuss a debt. The beating began. Agro and the men with him attacked Iannuzzi so severely that Joe believed they intended to kill him. He was struck repeatedly, knocked down, kicked while he was on the floor. One of the last things he would later remember, before losing consciousness, was Agro's alligator loafer driving into his ribs. Then everything went black. The men left him there, believing they had taught Joe Dogs a lesson he would never forget. They were right. They just had no idea what lesson Joe had learned, because Iannuzzi survived, and when he recovered, he did not go looking for another mafia crew to protect him. He went to the FBI. The Gambino associate who had spent years earning money for organized crime agreed to walk straight back into the same world. Only this time he would be carrying something the men around him could not see, a recording device. The FBI gave him money to repair his relationship with Agro. Joe returned to the men who had nearly killed him. He smiled. He ate with them. He listened. And for approximately 2 years, they talked about gambling, loan sharking, bribes, mafia relationships, criminal businesses, and people much higher in the organization than Joe Dogs. The operation became so productive that evidence generated through Iannuzzi eventually reached figures connected to the highest levels of organized crime. But then his secret got out. The mafia learned Joe Dogs was working for the FBI. And this time, they were not going to beat him. They wanted him dead. To understand how one restaurant beating turned a Gambino associate into one of the FBI's most valuable windows into the mafia in South Florida, you have to understand who Joseph Iannuzzi was before he ever wore a wire. Joe Dogs did not begin as an innocent man trapped by gangsters. He had spent years choosing the life. Born in the New York area, Iannuzzi came of age around gambling and street crime. He served in the United States military during the Korean War and received Purple Hearts for wounds suffered during his service. But whatever discipline the military gave him did not lead him toward an ordinary life when he returned home. Crime did. Iannuzzi stole. He gambled. He booked bets. And over time, he developed the kind of connections that could turn a small-time criminal into something much more profitable. Eventually, he moved south. Florida, in the 1960s and 70s, was becoming enormously attractive to organized crime. Money was pouring into the state. Tourism was growing. Retirees arrived with savings. Hotels, restaurants, and nightlife created legitimate businesses where illegal money could hide. Gambling remained a constant source of income, and New York mafia families already understood that South Florida could become an extension of their operations. Iannuzzi found his opportunity there. Then, Thomas Agro entered his life. Tommy A. was a made member of the Gambino crime family. He was feared for his temper and his willingness to use violence. For Joe Dogs, however, Agro initially represented something else: access. Being connected to a made Gambino soldier changed the kind of criminal business Joe could conduct. A loan shark with no mafia protection had to rely entirely on his own reputation. A loan shark backed by a Gambino soldier carried somebody else's reputation into every collection. Borrowers understood that failing to pay Joe might not mean dealing only with Joe. That was the value of the relationship. Agro supplied money. Joe put that money onto the street. Borrowers paid interest. Joe collected. A portion went back to Agro. The difference could make Iannuzzi substantial money. And the more successful the operation became, the deeper Joe moved into Agro's world. His nickname came from gambling. Iannuzzi spent enough time around dog tracks that Tommy Agro began calling him Joe Dogs. The name stayed. Soon Joe was doing far more than gambling. He became involved in bookmaking and loan sharking and moved around men connected to the Gambino family. The relationship with Agro was profitable because both men understood what the other provided. Joe knew Florida. Agro had mafia authority. Together they could make money neither man could make as easily alone. But there was a problem built into the arrangement. The money Joe put onto the street did not belong entirely to Joe. Agro expected his share. And when payment stopped arriving on time, friendship became irrelevant. By 1980, Iannuzzi had fallen behind. Accounts differ on the exact amount at different stages of the dispute, with some contemporary summaries describing roughly $8,000 at the heart of the immediate conflict, and other accounts describing larger sums still outstanding on the street. What matters is what Agro believed. Joe had his money. Joe was not paying, and Joe was becoming difficult to reach. Then Iannuzzi made the situation worse. During a trip to New York, Joe reportedly snubbed Agro. For a man like Tommy A., this was no longer only about dollars. It was disrespect. And disrespect inside a mafia relationship could become more dangerous than the original debt. Joe eventually returned to Florida. The tension remained. Then came the invitation. January 19th. Don Ritz Pizzeria, Singer Island. A restaurant should have felt safe, public, familiar. The kind of place where men could argue over money without attracting the attention that violence on the street might create. Joe went, and the moment he entered the situation, the balance had already shifted. Agro was not there to renegotiate. He was there to punish him. The attack was savage. Iannuzzi later described being beaten by Agro and other men until he lost consciousness. A baseball bat was associated with the assault in later accounts. Joe was kicked repeatedly. Agro's shoe driving into his ribs became one of the memories he carried from the attack. Then the world disappeared. When Iannuzzi woke up, something fundamental had changed. He had spent years believing mafia relationships gave him protection. Now the same relationship had almost killed him. And Joe understood another fact. If Agro had been willing to go that far once, there was no guarantee the next meeting would end with Joe waking up. He had choices. He could run. He could try to find another connected figure, willing to mediate. He could attempt to repay everything and hope Agro considered the matter finished. Or he could destroy the men who had attacked him. Joe chose revenge. He contacted the FBI. For federal agents, Iannuzzi represented an extraordinary opportunity. He was not someone standing outside organized crime trying to guess how it operated. He was already inside. He knew the people. He understood the gambling language. He understood the loans. He knew where men met. He knew who trusted whom. Most importantly, Agro knew him. If investigators could repair the relationship between Joe Dogs and Tommy A., they would not need to infiltrate the crew from scratch. The informant could simply go home. There was one obvious obstacle: the money Agro believed Joe owed him. An informant returning empty-handed would immediately create suspicion, so the FBI helped Iannuzzi repay the money. From Agro's perspective, the lesson appeared to have worked. Joe had been punished. Joe had found the cash. Joe had come back. The relationship could continue. Agro had no idea that the money helping restore his trust came from the government. The beating that was supposed to reinforce mafia discipline had just financed an FBI infiltration. The Bureau gave the investigation a name: Operation Home Run. The joke was deliberate. Agro had helped beat Joe with a baseball bat. Now the FBI intended to turn that bat into a case. Iannuzzi began recording conversations. At first, the danger was enormous. A recording device could shift under clothing. A wire could become visible. A suspicious mobster could suddenly decide to search him. Joe might walk into a house believing he was there for dinner and discover that somebody had heard a rumor. There would be no time to call an agent. No courtroom. No protection detail standing beside him. If the men around him discovered the microphone, Joe understood exactly what they were capable of doing. He had already experienced it without the wire. But revenge kept him moving. He met Agro. He met other connected figures. He allowed them to believe the old Joe Dogs had returned. And the most valuable part was that Joe did not need to interrogate anyone. He only needed to let mobsters do what mobsters frequently did around people they trusted: talk. Men discussed gambling. They discussed loans. They discussed who controlled which businesses. They discussed police. They discussed other mafia members. And because Joe Dogs had already spent years inside that world, They did not need to explain everything from the beginning. That gave the recordings value. A stranger asking too many questions would look suspicious. Joe could mention a name and allow the other man to finish the thought. He could complain about a payment, ask about somebody they both knew, talk about business the way he always had. The microphone did the rest. Then the FBI went further. Instead of merely recording mafia conversations wherever Joe happened to meet people, investigators helped create an environment they could control. A nightclub. The club would appear to be another criminal business opportunity. Joe would be part of it. An undercover FBI agent would be introduced as somebody Joe trusted. The mobsters would believe they were entering a place operated by friends. In reality, they were walking into an FBI operation. The undercover agent was presented to the mafia under the name John Marino. Joe vouched for him. That mattered. Organized crime depended heavily on introductions. You did not simply walk up to a Gambino soldier and announce that you wanted to join his gambling operation. Someone trusted had to say, "He is with me." Joe Dogs supplied that trust. The mobsters accepted Marino. And now the FBI had something more powerful than an informant wearing a wire. They had an undercover agent moving directly around mafia figures. The nightclub became a place where conversations could be monitored and relationships developed. Operation Home Run expanded. The investigation reached beyond Tommy Agro. Men from different organized crime circles appeared. Gambling operations became visible. Corruption became visible. Law enforcement relationships became visible. Joe Dogs had opened the door. Then the people walking through it began incriminating themselves. Years later, Iannuzzi described his role very simply. The men convicted themselves with their own mouths. He only recorded them. That description hides how dangerous the work actually was. Every conversation required Joe to maintain the identity he had spent years building. He could not suddenly become cautious about crimes he had previously embraced. He could not ask questions like an FBI agent. He could not appear nervous every time somebody mentioned murder. He had to remain Joe Dogs. The gambler, the loan shark, the criminal. The man Tommy Agro believed he had already beaten back into line, and Agro kept talking. That was the extraordinary part. The man who had nearly killed Joe became one of the people helping Joe build the case. Every time Agro trusted him with information, the beating at Don Ritz became more expensive. But Operation Home Run was never going to remain secret forever. Large investigations create movement. Agents communicate. Prosecutors become involved. Information passes between offices. And eventually, according to later accounts from people involved in the investigation, an FBI agent confronted Agro and revealed that Iannuzzi was cooperating. The effect was immediate. The secret moved through the underworld. Joe Dogs was a rat. Everything changed. The men who had eaten with him began thinking backward. Which conversations had Joe recorded? Which meetings had he attended? What had they said in his presence? Who else had he introduced? Was the club compromised? Was John Marino really who Joe claimed he was? Every memory became evidence. And for Iannuzzi, the danger became immediate. There was no longer a reason for the mafia to pretend the relationship could be repaired. Agro knew what Joe had done. The Gambinos knew. Other organized crime figures knew. The man they had failed to kill in the pizzeria had spent years collecting their voices. Now they wanted another chance. Iannuzzi was moved into government protection, but even that did not end the danger. At one point, after his cooperation became known, Joe survived an attempt on his life on a Florida interstate. The threat was no longer theoretical. The mafia knew the informant was alive. They knew he could testify, and unlike a recording device, Joe could stand in front of a jury and explain exactly what the recordings meant. That made him far more dangerous. An audio tape can capture a sentence. An insider can translate it. Joe could explain nicknames, relationships, money, why one man deferred to another, why a seemingly harmless conversation mattered, and he did. Over the following years, Iannuzzi testified repeatedly in organized crime prosecutions. His cooperation helped cases against men who had once treated him as one of their own. Tommy Agro was among them. So were other organized crime figures whose conversations and relationships had been exposed through the operation. Evidence generated around Joe Dogs also contributed to the broader federal assault on mafia gambling and racketeering in South Florida. The man Agro tried to silence had become a witness prosecutors could use again and again. And there was a larger consequence. The early 1980s were a turning point in the federal government's war against the American Mafia. For decades, organized crime survived partly because outsiders could see individual crimes without understanding the organization behind them. A bookmaker was arrested. A loan shark was arrested. Someone disappeared. A truck was stolen. But connecting those crimes upward toward captains, consigliere figures and bosses was much harder. Informants like Joe Dogs changed that. They gave investigators context. At the same time, federal agents were becoming increasingly aggressive with electronic surveillance. The RICO statute allowed prosecutors to present criminal organizations as enterprises rather than isolated defendants. One investigation could feed another. One informant could identify the next target. And information from people operating at Joe's level could help investigators understand what they were seeing at the top. The Gambino family was entering a dangerous period. Paul Castellano was boss. He tried to present himself as a businessman more than a street gangster. But federal investigators were moving closer. Electronic surveillance would eventually penetrate even Castellano's Staten Island mansion. Conversations captured there became enormously important to prosecutors. The mafia's traditional protections were failing. Social clubs could be bugged. Homes could be bugged. Telephones could be tapped. Cars could be followed. And now, longtime associates could walk into meetings carrying FBI microphones. Joe Dogs represented exactly the nightmare mafia leaders feared. Not an outsider, an insider who had changed sides. But there is a reason Iannuzzi's story cannot be reduced to hero versus villain. Joe did not cooperate because he suddenly developed a moral objection to organized crime. He said himself that revenge drove him. The mafia had betrayed him, so he betrayed the mafia. That distinction makes the story more revealing. The organization demanded loyalty from men while enforcing that loyalty through fear. But fear has a limit. If you frighten a man enough, he may obey. If you convince him you are going to kill him anyway, obedience no longer offers protection. Tommy Agro crossed that line. Before January 19th, Joe Dogs had reasons to remain loyal. Money, status, relationships, fear. After the beating, the calculation changed. If the mafia could kill him despite years of friendship, what exactly was Joe protecting by remaining silent? Agro believed violence would restore control. Instead, it destroyed the only thing protecting him from Joe: trust. And the consequences kept growing. Tommy Agro eventually faced serious federal charges. He pleaded guilty to racketeering-related offenses while gravely ill and died of cancer in 1987. By then, Joe Dogs had already become known throughout organized crime as a government witness. The life he had built in Florida was gone. His old friends were gone. His identity had become dangerous. Witness protection meant leaving familiar places and living under restrictions designed to keep the mafia from finding him. For someone who had spent years surrounded by people, restaurants, gambling, and nightlife, the isolation could be severe. But Joe survived. Then he did something few mafia informants managed successfully. He turned his criminal past into another career. He wrote. His autobiography told the story of his life inside organized crime and his decision to cooperate. Then came cookbooks. That might sound strange until you understand how central food had been to the world, Joe described. Mobsters met over meals. Arguments happened over meals. Deals were discussed over meals. Men celebrated after crimes over meals. And Joe himself loved cooking. So the former Gambino associate began combining mafia stories with recipes. The man once known for loan sharking and gambling became known to a completely different audience through books. There was an irony to it. A restaurant had nearly ended his life. Food later became part of how he made a living outside the mafia. But Joe never completely escaped the consequences of his cooperation. Witness protection came with rules, and Iannuzzi was not always good at following rules. In 1993, he left protection to promote his work publicly, including an appearance connected to television publicity in New York. That decision cost him his place in the program. The government could move him, hide him, give him another identity. But it could not force Joe Dogs to disappear if Joe refused to stay hidden. So eventually, he lived with the risk himself. He stayed away from many of the places and people connected to his old life. He understood that some grudges did not expire simply because decades passed. And he continued telling the story. The beating, the FBI, the wire, the club, the trials, the men who trusted him, and the strange sequence of events that began because Tommy Agro believed violence would solve a debt problem. Think about how differently that night could have ended. If Agro had simply demanded repayment, Joe might have remained useful to him. If he had cut Joe off, Iannuzzi might have disappeared from the Gambino orbit. If he had humiliated him without convincing Joe that his life was in danger, perhaps Joe would have accepted it. Instead, Agro chose overwhelming violence. He wanted Joe to understand exactly who controlled the relationship. Joe understood. Then he found someone more powerful. The federal government. The FBI gave him money, equipment, agents, protection, and eventually an entire undercover operation. Tommy Agro had the muscle to beat Joe Dogs, nearly unconscious, inside a pizzeria. The FBI had the resources to turn the survivor into a weapon. That was the mistake. The beating did not eliminate a liability. It created an informant. The Mafia had always understood that greed could make men betray each other. What it underestimated was how effectively revenge could do the same thing. Joe did not need prosecutors to convince him that cooperating was morally correct. He wanted the men who attacked him to pay. The FBI simply gave him the machinery to make that happen. And once Joe returned to the crew, the men around him supplied the rest themselves. They talked. They trusted him. They accepted his undercover partner. They walked into the operation. And eventually, the conversations that once made Joe feel like part of the family became evidence against that family. Joseph Iannuzzi lived for decades after the night at Don Ritz. He died in Texas in September 2015. By then, the mafia world he had known in South Florida had changed dramatically. Many of the men around him were dead. Others had gone to prison. The federal government had spent decades using informants, undercover agents, bugs, and racketeering prosecutions to dismantle the kind of crews Joe once considered powerful. But his story still captures one of the Mafia's greatest contradictions. Violence created obedience. Until it created betrayal. Tommy Agro believed Joe Dogs owed him money. He believed a brutal beating would remind Joe who was in charge. Instead, Joe woke up and decided he no longer had anything to lose. The next time he sat across from his Mafia friends, they saw the same man. Same face. Same stories, same appetite, same Joe Dogs. What they could not see was the FBI listening with him. And all of it began because the mob tried to silence him over a debt. They left him alive. Joe Dogs made sure they regretted it.